Welcome to the milestone 25th Miami Jewish Film Festival, the world's largest festival of its kind. We would like to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. My name is Miriam Singer. I have the privilege of serving as President and CEO of Jewish Community Services of South Florida. It is indeed a pleasure today to be moderating a virtual conversation with Aviva Armour-Ostroff, co-writer, co-director, and lead actress of our film, Lune. Thank you all for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Aviva? We'd like to know you.
Thank you. Well, my name is Aviva. I am a 46-year-old woman that has just relocated from Toronto, Ontario to Hamilton, Ontario, which is a pretty small city just outside of Toronto. I was privileged enough to go to an arts high school where I majored in drama, and both in real life and at school. And then I went to theater school following that. And I've been working as an actor and a producer, mostly in the theater. My partner, Arturo, comes from a documentary background. And 5 years ago, we decided to combine our skills and we made a movie. And that stuck. And I really wanted to tell this story, which is based on my life. And I wrote it as a play. And then once I had fallen in love with the film medium, I adapted it to film and we shot it at the end of 2019.
Wow, beautiful. And what inspired you to pursue your work as using the film medium as a filmmaker?
Great question. I think both theater and film can be very complementary towards each other. Like both have elements that are specific to their own medium, but can really complement each other. I love the feeling of performing live, and I don't love the fact that you pour your heart and soul and guts into something and then it's gone. And with film, you have it forever. So I think there's a lot of nuance to be found in film that is more challenging in theater. But I think on the baseline, I wanted this film to live on, and I didn't want to have to perform it over and over every night.
Understood. An amazing legacy and sense of permanency in terms of filmmaking. And watching it over and over, and you cue into different aspects and sort of illuminations of different aspects of the movie as you watch it over time. I've had the pleasure of watching it 3 times now in a very compact time and find it to be very powerful and very impressive. Would you share with us the process that you went through? It seems to be a very personal film, so please share.
Okay, thank you for that question and that compliment. It's very personal. It's really my life with my dad. So the character of Miriam is based on my father, who was a South African-born Jew. He emigrated to Canada in the mid-70s, where he met my mom and had me. And he raised me partly in Montreal, partly in South Africa, and mostly in Toronto. And he would have manic episodes. In my teen years, it was probably once a year that he would have a pretty major episode. And he would either end up in jail or the hospital or both. And we were very, very close, lots of love there. And also, as you can imagine, very challenging to be the parent of your parent at times. So I wrote this as a play in grade 12, in my grade 12 playwriting course. And it won an award at the Sears Drama Festival, and then I put it away. And at that point, it was really just a direct ripoff of my life. It was a father and a daughter, and then two police show up at the end, and that was the play. And then in my 30s, I pulled it out again, and that's when I decided to make the character a woman so that I could play her. I wanted to play somebody that was strong and smart and fierce and challenging and all the things that my dad was. And so selfishly, I created it as a vehicle for myself to perform. And then, like I said, a few years after that, I changed it from a play into a film.
And so tell us about Mike and the character of Mike and that relationship, and whether it is also based on reality and how that influenced the script and the ultimate film.
In my teens, my dad would befriend my male friends, and they, because they were 17 and going through existential crises, really latched onto him, really loved meeting a grown-up who was just as into Nietzsche as they were. So that element is true. My boyfriend when I was 17 was not a Black man, he was a white man. And so I added the fact that Mike was Black to add more dramatic tension and to give that character more of a sense of purpose and his own journey through the film. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes, it's so interesting. You're taking us along all these roads, interesting paths to learn about you and the genesis of the film and the creativity that goes with it. I wonder, what about the comparisons or the distinctions that were, to my eye, very stark between the two mothers in the film?
Mm-hmm.
Eliza's mom and Mike's mom.
Yeah. That's exactly what I wanted, is to contrast a mother that is more of a good mother, more present, more caring, more able to take care of her child, versus the character of Miriam, who's more of a narcissist and the child has to take care of her more. And again, on a much more, I don't know the word, but from much more superficial or outward level, I was also conscious of wanting to create a part for an older Black woman, because they're not often on screen, just like any woman over 50.
So true, very true, even in today's world in 2021, unfortunately. So I even saw the character of Mike's mom evolved from a more structured, contained character to one that was caring for Eliza.
Mm-hmm.
Was that with intention to develop the character in that way? And were you influenced by someone who you might have seen transform in that manner?
I don't know if I was influenced by anybody specifically, but hopefully when creating a character, you're creating multi-dimensions. So you don't ever want to create a character that is just one dimension, one angle. So I wanted to, yes, it was conscious to see her transform from, on her kid's butt about getting his marks up to being able to be kind and caring and nurturing. And hopefully you're able to see that she probably nurtures her own son as well. She's not only hard on. And truthfully, because of time, a lot of scenes were cut. So there was more of her in the script, but due to the original cut being like 2.5 hours, we had to cut some people and some scenes out.
So in terms of the politics of the film, the tension in terms of Israel versus Palestine, the confrontation with the rabbi within the synagogue, share with me a little bit of the background for that. And was that also part of the politics that you learned from your dad? Is that part of your experience and your worldview?
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a direct plagiarism from my dad and his life. There was, I think, 3 times at least that he tried to convert his synagogue into a theater. When he was manic, he would either get very, very religious, almost orthodox, or very, very anti-religious. And yeah, he was definitely opposed to the occupation in Palestine. He was very emotionally moved by it. There were times when something in the news would trigger a manic episode in him. So apartheid and the occupation in Palestine were definitely real passion points for my dad. And his family, like my uncle and my aunt are both Zionists. They both live in Israel. And so there was conflict there. And I think there was a lot of conflict internally for my dad, who was raised as a religious Jew and then was sort of the black sheep of the family because he didn't follow the religion. So he and I had a lot of conversations about race versus religion. And I myself identify as a Jew by race, by blood, but I'm not a practicing religious Jew, which is, I feel like it's one of the only race/religions in the world that can straddle both spheres like that.
Understood. There was also a great deal of commentary that I picked up, and I would love to hear your intention in communicating messages about the continuum of care or lack thereof of mental health services for the characters. Would you please share information about how it is that you shape the narrative, and was it all based on your experiences with your father? Is there any additional influence are there other influences that you might have had in regard to mental health care?
It's very different the way we speak about mental health now than it was 30 years ago. And there's still a lot of work to do in terms of providing support for people. I think there's a lot more awareness. It's definitely much more okay to be public about any mental issues you're having. But in the 90s, it was, I mean, I spent a lot of my life just saying that he was crazy because I didn't know terminology. It was definitely not accepted. And there were definitely a lack of resources in the first place. And any resources were completely underfunded and underserviced. So when I would see him in hospitals, I mean, first of all, he would often go to jail versus a hospital. So that's a problem in and of itself. And I that still happens, especially to racialized people, I think. And the hospitals themselves were like archaic, like Bedlam-esque. And in a way that it was almost like a stereotype, like, am I in a bad film where they used a set from jail? Because that's what it feels like. And that's just about lack of education and lack of money being poured into the resources there. So I haven't visited a mental health ward in the last 20 or so years. I don't know how much that they have changed. I think, like most hospitals, they are still chronically underfunded and understaffed. But there is more and more awareness. So your question to, was I influenced with anything other than my experience with my dad? And not really because of where the film is set in the 90s. I used my experience from them. But it's, of course, with a lens of knowledge, more of my knowledge of my own mental health, my friends' mental health, more awareness of the actual condition of bipolar and how it can affect people so differently, but the symptoms are kind of the same. And I guess the biggest change for me was thinking, if this character had the same experiences as my dad, but was a woman, how differently was she affected? Like, would they put her in jail as quickly as they would put a man in jail? Would she be, how much more danger would she be in if she was in a confined space? Like, those kind of questions influenced me and my writing more than my tactical experience, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. The agency where I have the privilege to work is a social and health services agency, nonprofit. And we have 3 mental health practices. So I'm always curious about opportunities, tools, and resources to provide education about mental illness, to destigmatize mental illness. And I wonder if you've considered that in addition to an artwork, the film is really an opportunity for advocacy and education and destigmatization. Do you see it that way? And if so, how would you propose to use it? Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I've thought about it quite a lot, because my main hope would be that people that have experienced mental illness, either directly or indirectly, would feel less alone. I hope that the character of Miriam is not a cliche. I think often we find anybody in film or TV that suffers from a mental issue, they're a caricature. There's often, you don't see the person, you see somebody playing crazy or acting crazy. And so I hope that I have not done that. I hope that people are able to have compassion for this person and maybe even like her, and then be annoyed by her and all those things that, you know, you experience with anybody. So if I am successful in that, then I would hope that people would be able to feel a little more connected, like you said, educated, and aware of the illness, not as, oh, anybody with a mental illness is just a crazy person locked away, but to have a little bit more of a human understanding of the human.
I think you did a phenomenal job in humanizing the characters and making it feel as if, at least for me, as if I was part of the story rather than an outside observer. So if that was your intent, at least with one viewer, you've achieved your goal.
Right.
I wonder about the casting, other than yourself, of course. Tell me a bit about your journey in terms of casting and how did you go about finding Eliza and Mike's mom? And there were a few other characters whose name I don't recall. And when did you have the aha moment? How did you know that these were the right, not only in terms of talent, but the chemistry with one another? How did that work out?
Chloe, we had a round of auditions that she wasn't able to come to. My first
Chloe is Eliza?
Chloe is Eliza, her name.
Okay.
Yeah. So I reach out to theater people because I am a theater person and I love working with theater people. There's a shorthand that's immediately present. And in our auditions, I realized, oh, I need a dancer, like not an actor that can move, but somebody that can really dance, that you believe she could get into a dance school. So that made the search quite specific. And through a series of events, Chloe was unable to come to those auditions. And so she ended up coming to our house. And I had seen her tape, and immediately I knew, watching her, that her acting was right. Like she wasn't performing, she just was, which is my favorite kind of acting. And then she sent us a tape of her dance, which I showed to Monica, our choreographer, who agreed she can dance. And then when we met face to face, when she came to our house, we hugged right away. Like it just was a natural, like, hi. And when she left, I wanted to run down the street being like, I want you for the part. I wanted to chase after. And Arturo said, no, that's really unprofessional. Don't do that. And one amazing thing about Chloe is that her job is a nurse. She works at a major downtown Toronto hospital in the emergency department. So that adds a whole element to the film, that, and to her character and to her relationship with me, that you just couldn't ask for. Like you couldn't act that. That's in her cells. And Vlad, who plays Mike, he's from Montreal, and I had to chase him. He originally was like, meh, no thanks. And I had to chase him down. And as soon as I met him and saw his performance, I felt like this is the right person. And again, somebody that has a theater background, and I really the more I work, the more important it is for me to work with good, kind people, because there's a lot of talent. There's no need to work with anybody that is a jerk. So that is even evident in an audition, you know, how somebody relates to the other actors, how generous they are. And fundamentally, the basis of good acting is good listening. So if you've got somebody that's a good listener, you're gold. And then almost everybody else, Mike's mom was played by a woman named Andrea, and she auditioned, again, theater person. And everybody else was just a direct ask because I knew them already.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So in addition to relationship issues, the issues of politics, the issues of religion, and mental health, and the care system, our stigma, how people see individuals that are experiencing mental health challenges, if there is one message or one takeaway that you would like the viewer, your partner in film here in the viewing audience, to take away with them from your film, what would that be?
Because there are so many themes, I would want the audience to pick what resonates for them. I hope that the film isn't a black or white, this is good, this is bad. And I would want the film to elicit discussion. So whether that's discussion about mental health, whether or racism or religion, whatever bubbles up to the viewer and stays with them, if they leave the theater or their iPad or their computer feeling inspired to have a conversation, or are thinking about something that they hadn't thought about before, then my job is done.
Wonderful. So my next set of questions are more about sort of the mechanics and involved with the art of how do you put it all together. So you have these amazing actors that you found in different ways, and you have this incredible, strong and powerful script. So what about funding? What about the set? What about all sort of those logistics of the business side of making it real? Can you share with us a bit of detail on that?
Sure, I'll be completely transparent. In Canada, we are lucky enough to have arts councils. And so Arturo and I applied for grants, and we got them. Or we got 2 out of 3 grants, and that took us to half our budget. So the entire budget for the film, including post-production, was $200,000, which for me is a huge amount of money, and for a feature film, it's nothing. And so the Canada Council for the Arts and the Toronto Arts Council funded the majority of that. And when we were producing our first film, we met with a man who is an angel named Jefferson Mappin, and he funded a lot of our first film, and then came on board as the executive producer for this film, for Lune. And that's simply because we are blessed, and he wants to promote Canadian independent film.
That's
Yeah,
remarkable.
so couldn't actually be luckier. We really lucked out. So from there, we start with, we rented that apartment, and some of it was shot in our backyard. Some of it was shot, it's all asking people for favors, asking people to do something for a fraction of the cost. that they would normally charge. Even with ACTRA, which is our union, usually actors are paid, a minimum of $800 to $1,000 a day, but we're paying $200 because our budget is so small. So everything is sort of relation to a bigger budget movie. So it's a lot of begging and borrowing and asking favors. I feel like that's what producing is just asking people for favors.
It's like running a nonprofit agency, Aviva,
Exactly.
in some ways.
Yeah, it is, because it's not for profit. Like, nobody's making money from it. And it's a lot of asks, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So bringing it back to the writing aspects, do you see an opportunity for a sequel or for a continuity of the story for your next film? Have you thought about that?
I wonder if it would be more elements of characters that would show up. It does feel like the film was an homage to my dad, and I don't know if that was my intention when I first started it, but Arturo and I now joke that it's like my dad called himself Dr. Bro, Dr. Bro's Greatest Hits. That's the movie that we made. So maybe there's room for more exploration of those themes, but it would be a different story. For me, there's so much darkness still to be explored in the mental health system, and I didn't really mine it as much as I would have liked to in this particular story. So, but to be honest with you, I don't have anything that's like, the next story I'm going to tell is this one. I don't know, but I think there's because of my relationship with my dad, he will always be in my work, no matter what it is.
Very special. I wonder what the reaction of your family members were. Your dad's family, anyone around the familial or non-familial group in terms of the reactions to the film?
Yeah. The family members that I know have seen it, that have contacted me, I think the overwhelming reaction was how much I had captured my dad. So I don't know if they could sit in the story other than be like, wow, she really looks like Brian, or wow, Brian really said that. Or I think that was the first hit. My dad has a son, so my half brother, that lives, born and raised in Amsterdam, is a musician, and had only met my dad a handful of times throughout the years. And I've only met him a handful of times throughout the years, but we're in contact in Facebook. And he looks very much like my dad, which is really interesting. And so I asked him to do the music for the end of the film. So the last song in the credits is written by me and my brother. And yeah, I think for him, he was proud of me as his sister. He could see it as a piece of art, but overall it was like, there's that man who's my dad. Yeah.
Okay. So there's one element that we haven't talked about. We've talked about the politics of the Middle East, but we haven't talked about racial politics. And there are many threads, many narratives, nuanced and pretty blatant, about race in this world, and bias and so on. The whole narrative about the election of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and the yearning to travel to vote, and the changing of race in order to be identified as a person of color. Can you share with us some more detail about the development of that narrative and how the bridge with your dad and the experience growing up?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a poem in the film. Up until the age of 13, I was under the impression I was white. And that is my dad's poem. So he was standing in South Africa, I guess it was the early 60s or late 50s, and he was on the white side of the tracks, the train tracks. And because he's dark skinned, he's a bit darker than me, he was hit to the ground. A station master whacked him, hit him to the ground, thinking that he was colored. And the poem says that blow like I'll never forget it, or I'm paraphrasing poorly, I forget my lines already. But I'll never forget it, and I hope I never will, because it woke me up to reality. So that at the age of 13, he was made aware of what it is to walk around in different skin. And when I lived in South Africa, we lived as Jews, which are basically as white people. We had a black maid and a black servant, like a black gardener, but we would drive around to Zimbabwe and the townships. And so as a 7 or 8-year-old, I saw how Black people were treated in their tiny tin shacks of homes. And I had a visceral response to it. I remember dead cows in the street. I remember pulling over the car to give some kids that were walking some food, and they ran away from us. They were scared of us because we were whites, rightfully so. And there was, places we would visit that didn't have electricity. And it just was a completely new experience for me that transformed my worldview. And because I look the way I look, every time I get into a taxi, or every time I go to a store, or every time I meet with somebody, they assume I'm from their country, which I love, aside from maybe China, but I could be from anywhere, which has been a huge gift to me. I love that. I look like I'm ethnically ambiguous, which is, in my experience, a huge gift, and brings awareness to, if I go to small town Ontario, I'm the darkest person on the street, and I feel it. People look at me a different way. So from that, I can imagine how it is to live in darker skin and be treated depending on what you look like. Like we're all going to be treated differently depending on what we look like, for better or worse. But for my dad, that experience was an awakening to the inequality and unjustness that can happen, that does happen. And it transformed him, and he spent the rest of his life really fighting for that awareness. And I guess using his white privilege for good, right? Because he could say but he also, in his manic phases, he would convert to being a Muslim, and he would, so, there's some times where I was like, how does that work? But in terms of his heart and his politics and his ethics, they were right on. He genuinely tried to get his status changed from white to colored, because we as Jews were technically colored, and it was a political strategy because the South African government needed us to look like whites, so we would vote white. So he was much more worldly and educated than I am. My dad was, and could give you a clearer argument on that. I just have like a guttural response to it, whereas he could have an intellectual, analytical response to it. But in terms of the film, those ideologies are stolen from real life Brian, trying to change his status at the South African embassy.
Well, the transmission or channeling of Brian into your character Miriam, and sort of the intellectual depth and worldliness of the narrative that she shared was really impressive. Right. And it came through in a very bright and loud way. So you've, at least again with one viewer, you've achieved that, and I hope others, I'm sure, have learned so much from your film. May I ask what you're working on now? What's next?
I'm shooting a short film next weekend, and it's just for fun. It's just a zombie apocalyptic. We created it so we could shoot something during COVID. So we're shooting it outside and kind of, if you can, making fun of a viral attack. And then my partner and I are currently looking for a new script for a new feature. And we don't know what that is yet, but we're very slowly starting. I am not somebody that is very prolific. my partner is. I take a long time, I think, to regenerate. I find like my creative juice for my creative passion, it goes into raising my child and, unpacking my new house. And I'm really happy doing that. And I trust now I'm old enough to know that eventually the creativity comes back. And I just need it to be dormant for a while in order to regenerate like a spring.
Wow. So learned so much from you in the short amount of time, and look forward to viewing the film again, even, and inviting other friends to enjoy the experience that we have been so privileged to have as a gift from you and from Arturo to our community. And again, I want to thank you for that gift, and also again to thank all of our supporters and our viewers at the Miami Jewish Film Festival and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, the amazing team at SAGE, the Central Agency for Jewish Education. This is a jewel of a film, and kol hakavod, mazal tov, and wishing you the best of success as you continue to offer us gifts of learning through film.
Thank you so much for your kindness, Miriam, and your time.
Thank you.